Grief is rarely the grand, weeping specter the movies suggest. In my experience, it usually arrives via third-party courier in a cardboard box that smells faintly of diesel and industrial adhesive. I stood in the sterile, fluorescent-bright corridor of the advanced materials wing, holding the package with the same detachment I'd apply to a contaminated sample. It was 11 in the morning on a Tuesday. The lab hummed with the steady, reassuring thrum of the ventilation system, a mechanical heart that didn't skip beats or harbor grudges. Grief arriving by courier, I remarked to the empty hallway. My voice sounded thin against the concrete, right on schedule. I used my pocket knife to slice through the packing tape. Inside, nested in layers of festive, floral tissue paper that felt aggressively cheerful for a Tuesday, was a heavy ceramic jar. It was painted with stylized sunflowers, the kind of kitsch that Miriam Locke believed passed for high art. Taped to the lid was a cream-colored envelope. I didn't need to open it to recognize the handwriting. Miriam's script was a series of sharp, upright needles, every letter standing at attention as if terrified of slouching. I set the jar on a rolling equipment cart and pulled the note free. Gavin, thinking of you and Maya. These were her favorites. Love, Mom. The word Mom always sat in my stomach like a piece of unrefined lead. She wasn't my mother, and since the funeral, she had transitioned from a distant annoyance into a looming, administrative presence in my life. She didn't offer comfort, she offered oversight. She didn't check in, she audited my parenting. The cookies were merely the latest entry in her ledger of performative concern. I opened the lid. The scent hit me immediately. Oatmeal, cinnamon, and a cloying, buttery richness that felt heavy in the recycled air of the lab. They looked perfect, uniform. Each one a precise circle, decorated with a single walnut half. Miriam didn't bake for pleasure, she baked for dominance. These were the cookies she brought to church bake sales to ensure no one else's tray was emptied first. Is that actual food in the clean zone? I didn't turn around. I knew the voice. Aris Cole was leaning against the doorframe of the spectroscopy suite, his white lab coat pristine, his expression caught between amusement and professional reprimand. Aris was a pharmacology consultant, a man who viewed the world through the lens of molecular stability. He was also the only person in this building who didn't look at me with the tilted head pity that had become my daily shadow. My mother-in-law's specialty, I said, gesturing toward the jar with the note. A peace offering, or a reminder that I'm failing to provide home-cooked meals. It's hard to tell with her. Sunflowers, Aris noted, walking over. She has a flair for the dramatic. She has a flair for control, I corrected. I reached into the jar, intending to take one just to prove I wasn't as bothered as I felt. The cookies were stacked tightly. As I tried to leverage one out, my fingers, usually steady enough for micropipetting, felt strangely clumsy. The ceramic was glazed to a high, slippery gloss. Careful, Aris said, but he was too late. The jar tipped. I lunged for it, my palm grazing the cool sunflower pattern. But the weight shifted toward the edge of the cart. It hit the floor with a sound like a small explosion. The ceramic didn't just crack, it shattered into 100 jagged yellow petals. Cookies tumbled across the linoleum, rolling under the equipment benches and shattering into crumbs. Damn it, I muttered, staring at the mess. It felt like a metaphor I didn't have the energy to analyze. I knelt to start gathering the larger shards. Aris stayed standing. Usually he'd be the first to grab a broom or a pair of gloves, but he remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the floor where the cookies had scattered. Gavin, he said. His voice had lost its casual lilt. It was the tone he used when a titration went sideways. I'll clean it up, Aris. It's just sugar and flour. Wait. He stepped forward, crouching beside me, but he didn't reach for the ceramic. He pointed to one of the cookies that had snapped in half upon impact. The interior was soft, almost underbaked, but there was something else. A small, concentrated pocket of white powder that hadn't fully integrated into the dough. A tiny, crystalline knot no bigger than a grain of salt. I looked at it, then back at the jar. Probably just a clump of baking soda. She's 60, Aris. Her mixing technique isn't what it used to be. Aris didn't laugh. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a pair of nitrile gloves, and snapped them on. He picked up the broken half, holding it close to his face, then walked it over to the light of the window. He wasn't looking at the walnut or the cinnamon. He was looking at the way the light refracted off those tiny, unmixed crystals. These were for Maya too? Aris asked quietly. She loves them, I said, a cold needle of apprehension pricking at the base of my neck. She had a couple of them from the batch Miriam brought over to the house yesterday. Why? Aris didn't answer immediately. He walked over to a nearby workstation, grabbed a glass slide, and scraped a tiny portion of the white crystalline matter onto the surface. The scent is off, he whispered, almost to himself. Cinnamon is a very effective masking agent. It's pungent, earthy, and it covers a variety of chemical bitterness. Aris, you're being paranoid. It's a cookie. It's a grandmotherly gesture from a woman I happen to dislike. He turned to look at me, his face a mask of professional neutrality that I found suddenly terrifying. You're a research chemist, Gavin. You know as well as I do that nature doesn't produce perfect white geometric crystals in a kitchen oven. This isn't flour. It isn't sugar. I stood up, the shards of the sunflower jar still clutched in my hand. One of the edges was sharp enough to sting, but I didn't let go. I thought about Maya. I thought about her falling asleep on the sofa last night, unusually heavy-limbed, her breathing a bit too shallow, a bit too slow. I had attributed it to the exhaustion of the last few months, to the weight of everything we had lost. She's a medical billing supervisor, I said, my voice sounding like it was coming from a great distance. Miriam. She knows her way around a formulary. She's obsessed with helping people manage their health. Aris placed the slide into a small transport container. He looked at the mess on the floor, the broken yellow flowers, the shattered treats, the remnants of a gift meant to signify healing and family. Don't touch these again, Aris said. His eyes met mine, and for the first time in a long time, the pity was gone. It had been replaced by something much sharper, something functional and cold. He didn't offer a hand on my shoulder. He didn't offer words of comfort. He simply turned toward the lab where the real work happened, leaving me alone in the hallway with the wreckage of Miriam's kindness. I looked down at the note still sitting on the cart. Love, Mom. I realized then that the system I had trusted, the idea of family, the assumption of basic human decency, wasn't just flawed. It was being used as a shroud. I didn't feel a surge of anger. Anger is a volatile gas. It dissipates. What I felt was the settling of a solid, a crystallization of purpose. I reached out and picked up the note, folding it neatly, precisely, until it was a small, sharp-edged square. I tucked it into my breast pocket, right over my heart. No one is coming to help, I whispered to the quiet hallway. The building hummed. The lights flickered once, then stabilized. I looked at the broken ceramic one last time, noting how the sunflowers seemed to mock the gray floor. Then I walked away from the mess, leaving the shards for the evening shift to find. I had a different kind of inventory to conduct. The diagnostic lab at the facility was a place of absolute clarity. There were no ghosts here, only data points and the hum of the mass spectrometer, a machine that stripped the world down to its atomic weight. I watched Aris move through the preparation phase. He was a man of deliberate motions, his hands steady as he dissolved a sample of the white crystal into a solvent. I stood by the pressurized glass window, my reflection a pale, translucent blur against the backdrop of stainless steel and calibrated instruments. The screening will take a few minutes, Aris said without looking up. He was already documenting the process in a digital log. He didn't use my name. He treated me like a visiting researcher, which was the greatest kindness he could offer. I've been going over the timeline, I said, my voice sounding flat even to my own ears. The lethargy started about 40 minutes after she finished the second cookie. I thought it was an emotional collapse. I thought she was just giving in to the weight of the house. Clinical observation is difficult when you're the subject, Aris replied. He tapped a command into the terminal. Don't blame your eyes for failing to see what they weren't trained to look for. I thought about the house. It was too quiet now, a hollow shell where every creaking floorboard sounded like an accusation. Miriam had been there nearly every day for 3 weeks. She'd moved through the kitchen like a Victorian governess, rearranging the pantry, sanitizing the surfaces, and speaking in a hushed, reverent tone that implied I was an invalid incapable of boiling water. She had brought 3 different tins of those cookies, one for the reception, one for the first week of mourning, and the sunflower jar for the office. The monitor flickered. A series of peaks began to form on the graph, vertical lines of varying heights that represented the molecular signature of the sample. Aris leaned in, his brow furrowed. He cross-referenced the results against the National Pharmaceutical Database. It wasn't a search for toxins, it was a search for compliance. It's not a poison in the traditional sense, Aris whispered. It's a sedative, a high-potency benzodiazepine derivative, usually reserved for severe acute anxiety or preoperative sedation. It's flavorless if refined correctly, but highly bitter if the binding agents aren't fully processed. I looked at the peak on the screen. It was tall and sharp, a jagged mountain of chemical intent. That shouldn't be in a kitchen. That's a controlled substance. Look at the manufacturing batch signature. Aris pointed to a secondary string of data. This isn't from a street source. This is hospital grade. It's dispensed through specific institutional pharmacies. The realization didn't hit me like a physical blow. It filtered into my mind like a slow-acting reagent. Miriam had spent 20 years as a medical billing supervisor. She knew every loophole in the insurance system, every pharmacy that didn't double-check a recurring refill for a long-term patient, and every physician who signed off on scripts without looking at the face of the person in the chair. She had spent decades navigating the bureaucracy of illness. She knew how to move things through the system. She wasn't trying to cause a permanent end, I said, the logic of it clicking into place with a sickening precision. She wanted Maya to be difficult. She wanted her to be sluggish, confused, needing more care. She wanted to prove that I couldn't handle a child who was struggling. She was creating a crisis so she could be the only solution. Aris turned the monitor away. I can't give you a formal report, Gavin. This was an off-book screen. If I log this, the regulatory boards get involved, the police get involved, and the custody of your daughter becomes a matter of public record before you can even get her to a doctor. I don't need a report, I said. I need to know she's okay. I left the lab without saying another word. The drive to the pediatric clinic felt like navigating through a thick gray fog, though the sky was a piercing, indifferent blue. I kept seeing Miriam's face, that soft, practiced expression of concern she wore like a mask. I saw her hand-feeding Maya a cookie, brushing crumbs from the girl's chin with a touch that I had mistaken for affection. It was a grooming process. She was conditioning the environment, making the child's stability dependent on the treats only grandma provided. At the clinic, the waiting room was a riot of primary colors and plastic toys. I found Maya in the corner, sitting on a small chair, her head resting against the wall. She looked pale. When she saw me, she didn't jump up. She just blinked, her pupils slightly dilated under the bright LED lights. "Hey, Peanut," I said, kneeling in front of her. My heart was a frantic, trapped thing, but my voice remained the calm, analytical tone of a researcher. "How are you feeling?" "Tired, Daddy," she whispered. "My legs feel like they're made of blankets." A nurse called our name. I carried her into the exam room. The doctor, a woman named Dr. Aris, no relation to my colleague, was thorough. I didn't mention the cookies, not yet. I told her Maya had been lethargic, showing signs of coordination loss. I watched as she checked Maya's vitals. "Her heart rate is a bit slow, and her reflexes are sluggish," the doctor noted, frowning. "It could be a reaction to the recent trauma. Children process grief in physical ways, Gavin. It's not uncommon for them to withdraw or experience somatic symptoms." "I want a full toxicology screen," I said. The doctor paused, her pen hovering over the chart. "That's a very specific request, Gavin. Do you have reason to believe she's been exposed to something?" "I work in a chemical lab," I lied, the words coming out smooth and practiced. "We had a minor containment breach yesterday. I caught a scent on my clothes when I got home. I want to be certain." The lie worked because it was grounded in my reality. It was a professional concern, not a parental panic. While they took the samples, I held Maya's hand. She didn't even flinch when the needle went in. She was too far under the influence of Miriam's kindness to feel the sting. 2 hours later, the doctor called me into her office. She looked unsettled. "We found traces of a sedative, Gavin, a significant amount for a 6-year-old. If she had ingested any more, we would be talking about respiratory depression. As it is, we need to keep her on an IV for observation. How could this have happened at your lab?" "It didn't," I said. I stood up, feeling a cold, crystalline clarity settle over me. I was mistaken about the source, but I know exactly where it came from now. "We have to report this," she said, reaching for the phone. "This is a safety issue." "Wait," I said, my voice dropping to a low, commanding frequency. "If you report this as an accidental exposure at a high-clearance research facility, my career is over and Maya goes into the system while they investigate the breach. Give me 24 hours to document the source myself. I have the equipment. I have the chain of custody. I will bring you the evidence on a silver platter, but I need to ensure the right person is held accountable, not the system." She hesitated, looking at the charts, then at me. She saw a grieving father who was also a man of science. She saw the controlled, rigid way I held myself. She nodded, slowly. 24 hours, Gavin. Then I call the authorities." I went back to Maya's room. She was asleep now, the IV line a thin plastic umbilical cord providing the fluids her body needed to flush out the interference. I sat by her bed and pulled out my phone. I didn't call the police. I didn't call a lawyer. I opened the insurance portal for our family plan. As the primary policyholder, I had access to the history of everyone covered under our umbrella, including the extended family riders Miriam had insisted on staying on Hanqiu for the discounts. I began to scroll through the pharmacy metadata. There it was. A recurring prescription for a sleep aid filled at a small pharmacy 3 towns over. It was under Miriam's name, but the dosage was astronomical. far more than a woman of her size would ever be prescribed for personal use. She had been stockpiling. She had been diverting. I looked at the timestamps. Every refill coincided with a visit to our house. Every time she came over to help, she was bringing a fresh supply of chemical control. She wasn't trying to lose Maya. She was trying to ensure that I would lose her. She wanted a court to see a father who couldn't keep his child awake, a father who was so lost in his own sorrow that he didn't notice his daughter slipping away. She wanted the burden of Maya's care transferred to her. I felt a strange, detached sense of admiration for the elegance of it. It was a low-impact, high-yield strategy. No violence, no visible harm, just a gradual erosion of my capability until the world agreed that I was unfit. I looked at Maya's pale face and felt a shift in my own internal chemistry. The man who trusted systems, the man who believed that if you followed the rules would protect you, was gone. He had been replaced by someone who understood that systems were just tools, and tools could be turned against their masters. I wasn't going to call her. I wasn't going to scream. That would be an emotional reaction, and Miriam fed on emotions. She was a scavenger of other people's distress. If I gave her a fight, she would use it to prove my instability. No, I was going to map her. I was going to find every thread she had woven into our lives, and I was going to pull them one by one until her entire world unraveled. I pulled out a notebook and began to draw a diagram. Miriam at the center. Ellen, her nervous shadow of a sister, on the periphery. The pharmacy records, the billing cycles, the social circles where she preened as the grieving, helpful grandmother. I wasn't looking for a way to stop her. I was looking for a way to delete her influence entirely. "No one is coming, Miriam," I whispered, the words a promise to the darkened room. I reached into my pocket and felt the square of the note she had written. Love, Mom. I took a pen and began to write on the back of it a list of names and dates. It wasn't a list of grievances, it was a list of vulnerabilities. By the time the sun began to set, casting long orange shadows across the hospital floor, I had the first phase of the map completed. Miriam thought she was playing a game of emotional leverage. She didn't realize she was dealing with a man who understood the fundamental laws of reaction. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. She had introduced a catalyst into my home. Now I was going to introduce a solvent into hers. Reconstruction is a clinical process. When a structure fails, you don't weep over the rubble. You examine the stress points, the quality of the mortar, and the environmental factors that led to the collapse. I sat in my home office, the blue light of the monitor washing over the walls, and began to reconstruct Miriam Locke. For years, I had viewed her through a lens of mild irritation, seeing a woman who was merely overbearing and perhaps a bit too fond of her own voice. Now, I saw the architecture of a predator. She had spent 24 years at the helm of a regional medical billing office. In that world, everything is a transaction. You find the code that allows for the highest payout. You negotiate with insurers who want to withhold resources. You learn exactly which signatures are required to move a person from one category of care to another. Miriam viewed human relationships as a series of billing codes. If a person wasn't providing the emotional dividend she required, she simply adjusted the claim. I spent the night looking through old emails, bank statements, and digital footprints. Miriam's sister, Ellen, appeared frequently in the margins. Ellen was the helpful aunt, the one who always arrived 15 minutes after Miriam to smooth things over. In the emails, Ellen's tone was always one of nervous compliance. "Are you sure we should do this, Miriam? Maybe Gavin won't notice." And Miriam's responses were always sharp, short, and focused on the greater good of the family. I began to see the pattern. It wasn't just the cookies. It was the way Miriam had systematically isolated my wife from her friends during her illness, claiming she was too tired for visitors. It was the way she had handled the funeral arrangements, positioning herself as the primary mourner while I was sidelined as the distraught husband who couldn't be trusted with the details. She had been practicing for this. She had been laying the groundwork for a world where I was a footnote in my own life. By 8 a.m., I had a clear picture of Ellen's routine. She worked part-time at a boutique stationery shop, but on Wednesday mornings, she went to a specific grocery store on the edge of town, the one with the organic section Miriam insisted on. I didn't want to see Miriam yet. You don't strike the center of the web first. You touch the outer strands to see how the silk vibrates. I found Ellen in the parking lot. She was loading a bag of kale and several cartons of almond milk into the back of her sensible beige sedan. She looked tired, her skin sallow under the harsh morning sun. When I stepped into her line of sight, she jumped, nearly dropping a carton of eggs. "Gavin, you startled me," she said, her hand fluttering to her throat. "How is little Maya?" Miriam said she was feeling under the weather. "Maya is in the hospital, Ellen," I said. I kept my voice low, steady, and entirely devoid of heat. She had a severe reaction to a specific sedative. The doctors were very concerned. Ellen's face didn't just go pale, it seemed to sag, the muscles losing their tension all at once. She fumbled with the grocery bag, her eyes darting toward the exit of the parking lot. A sedative? Oh, that's terrible. How could that happen? Did she get into your medicine cabinet? I don't keep sedatives in the house, Ellen. But Miriam does. A very specific brand. A very specific dosage. I took a step closer, not into her personal space, but just enough to ensure she couldn't look away. I've seen the pharmacy records, I've seen the batch numbers, and I've seen the lab results from the cookies Miriam brought over. Ellen began to shake. It was a fine, rhythmic tremor that started in her hands and moved to her shoulders. I told her it was too much. I told her you were smart, Gavin. I told her you would see. So you knew, I said. It wasn't a question. You watched her bake those cookies. You watched her put the powder into the dough. You watched her hand them to a 6-year-old child. She said she just needed her to be quiet. Ellen's voice rose to a frantic, thin squeak. She said you were too stressed, that you were going to have a breakdown and then the state would take Maya away. She said she was doing it for you, to make things easier so she could step in and help. She said it was a mild supplement, something to help her sleep. It was a preoperative sedative, Ellen. It suppresses the respiratory system. If she had eaten one more, I wouldn't be standing here talking to you about grocery shopping. Ellen collapsed against the side of her car, her breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. I didn't want anyone to get hurt. Miriam is so forceful. She convinced me it was the only way to keep the family together. She says you're not yourself since... She says you're unstable. I am perfectly stable, I said, and for the first time a small, cold smile touched my lips. In fact, I've never been more focused. I'm not going to the police, Ellen. Not yet. Because if I go to the police, you go with her. Accessory to the endangerment of a minor. I've already consulted with a friend in the legal field. The paper trail is very clear. What do you want? She whispered. I want you to keep acting, I said. I want you to go to Miriam's house. I want you to tell her that I'm struggling. Tell her I'm looking haggard. Tell her that the doctors think it's a viral infection and that I'm overwhelmed. I want her to feel like her plan is working. I want her to feel confident. Why? Because confidence leads to carelessness, I said, and I need her to be very, very careless for what comes next. I left Ellen trembling by her beige sedan. I didn't feel a sense of triumph. I felt the way a technician feels when they successfully calibrate a piece of heavy machinery. The lever had been pulled, the gears were turning. When I got home, I didn't go inside. I sat in my car in the driveway and looked at the house. It was a beautiful structure, but I realized that Miriam had been treating it like a piece of property she was in the process of foreclosing upon. She didn't want us to be happy. She wanted us to be hers. She wanted the version of us that was broken so she could be the one to glue the pieces back together in a shape that suited her. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Miriam. Gavin, I haven't heard from you all morning. Is Maya better? I have some soup I can bring over this evening. I'm so worried about you both. I stared at the screen. The audacity of the love mom persona was almost impressive. She was checking the progress of her work. She was waiting for the moment I would buckle, for the phone call where I would admit I couldn't handle the illness she had manufactured. I typed back, She's still very tired. I'm exhausted, Miriam. I don't know what to do. Please come by tomorrow night. I think I need to talk about the future. The response was almost instantaneous. Of course, dear, whatever you need. We'll get through this as a family. I put the phone down and walked into the house. I went to the kitchen and looked at the pantry. I began to remove everything she had touched. Every jar of jam, every box of crackers, every sympathy meal she had tucked into the freezer. I didn't throw them away. I placed them in a box in the garage, sealed with heavy-duty tape. They were evidence, but more than that, they were toxins I was removing from my environment. I spent the afternoon back on my computer. I wasn't looking at pharmacy records anymore. I was looking at the corporate structure of the medical billing company Miriam had retired from. She still held a significant amount of consultant stock, and she was still listed as an emeritus advisor for several regional clinics. Her reputation was her armor. It was the thing she used to intimidate Ellen and the thing she used to present herself as an authority to the world. I discovered that during her final 3 years, there had been a series of internal discrepancies regarding the billing of pediatric neurological services. They had been flagged, investigated, and then quietly settled without any public disclosure. Miriam had been the lead supervisor on those accounts. The settlement had been reached just months before her retirement. It was a beautiful, jagged piece of the map. It suggested a woman who didn't just manipulate her family, but someone who had spent her professional life manipulating the very systems of care she claimed to serve. She had been playing with people's lives on a balance sheet for decades. I began to draft a series of anonymous inquiries to the state regulatory boards, using the precise language I had learned from years of industrial compliance. I didn't make accusations, I simply asked for clarification on historical billing protocols, related to those specific accounts, citing my own background in regulatory oversight. I knew how the bureaucracy worked. A formal inquiry from a professional source would trigger a mandatory review. It wouldn't happen overnight, but the shadow was starting to move toward her. As evening fell, the house grew dark. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat in the living room, watching the street lamps flicker to life outside. I thought about the cookies, the oatmeal, the cinnamon, the walnut, the ingredients of a grandmother's love, laced with the ingredients of a captor's control. Miriam thought she was the one with the map. She thought I was a lost traveler wandering in the woods of my own grief, waiting for her to lead me out. She didn't realize that I had redesigned the forest. I had changed the landmarks. Every step she took from now on would feel like progress to her, but it would actually be leading her closer to the edge of the cliff I was building. The phone buzzed again. A message from a family group chat I had ignored for weeks. Miriam had posted a photo of Maya from a year ago, praying for our little girl. It's been such a hard road for Gavin, but we are standing by him. The comments from cousins and aunts poured in. You're an angel, Miriam. He's so lucky to have you. Take care of them. I felt a cold, sharp prick of amusement. Let them think she was an angel. It would make the fall that much more spectacular. When the truth arrived, it wouldn't be a sudden crash. It would be a slow, agonizing realization that every kindness she had ever shown was a calculated move in a game only she knew was being played. I stood up and went to the basement. I had one more task before tomorrow. I needed to prepare the presentation, not for a court, but for the mediated session I had already begun to arrange under the guise of estate planning and custody transition. I was going to give her exactly what she wanted, a meeting to discuss her role in Maya's future. She would come expecting a surrender. She would find an autopsy. The atmosphere in my living room was thick with the scent of lavender furniture polish and the suffocating weight of false sympathy. Miriam had arrived exactly 4 minutes early, a habit she maintained to establish temporal dominance. She had brought a lasagna, wrapped in foil and insulated by a thick kitchen towel, as if caloric density could compensate for a fractured soul. Beside her sat Ellen, who looked like a woman sitting in a room filled with invisible gas, her eyes darting toward me with a mixture of terror and pleading silence. Gavin, you look hollow, Miriam said, her voice a soft, practiced chime of concern. She didn't wait for an invitation. She moved toward the kitchen, her heels clicking on the hardwood with the precision of a metronome. I've told everyone in the family that you're simply pushing yourself too hard. It's no wonder Maya is struggling to recover. Children are sponges for the atmospheric instability of their parents. I sat at the dining table, my laptop closed but within reach. I didn't offer her tea. I didn't help her with the lasagna. I watched her move, the way she tilted her head when she spoke, the way she smoothed the lace on her sleeves. She was an actress who had played the role of the matriarch for so long that she had forgotten the script was fiction. The doctors are still running tests, I said, my voice as neutral as a dial tone. They found something in her system, Miriam, a chemical signature that shouldn't be there. I watched for the flicker. It was there, a microscopic tightening of the muscles around her eyes, a brief pause in the way she was setting the table. It lasted less than a second. Environment is everything, she replied, her back still turned to me. I've always said that industrial labs are no place for a family man. Contamination follows you home, Gavin. It's on your skin, in your hair. It's a miracle the poor thing hasn't been more affected before now. It wasn't from the lab, I said. Miriam turned around, a ceramic plate held in both hands like a shield. Then where? Some neighborhood influence? A lapse in your supervision? This is exactly why we need to discuss a transition. Ellen and I were talking on the drive over. We think it's best if Maya stays with me for the next few months. Just until you find your footing, just until the instability passes. Ellen let out a small, sharp breath that sounded like a leak in a pressurized tire. Miriam shot her a glance that could have etched glass, and Ellen immediately looked down at her lap. The timing of this suggestion is interesting, I remarked. I opened my laptop, especially considering what I've been looking at today. I've spent some time reviewing the legacy files from your time at the billing center, Miriam. I found it fascinating how many pediatric claims were flagged for unnecessary sedative prescriptions under your oversight. It seems there was a pattern of managing difficult cases through chemical intervention rather than behavioral therapy. It saved the insurers a lot of money, didn't it? And your bonuses were tied directly to those savings. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the refrigerator seemed to stop humming. Miriam didn't move, she didn't blink. The mask of the grieving grandmother didn't slip, it simply hardened into a porcelain grimace. I don't know what kind of fantasy you're constructing to deflect from your own failures as a father, she said, her voice dropping an octave. But I won't have my professional legacy questioned by a man who can't even keep his daughter out of the emergency room. I'm not questioning it, I said. The state regulatory board is. I submitted the inquiry this morning, along with the lab results from the sunflower jar. I stood up and walked toward the kitchen. I didn't stop until I was standing directly in front of her. I could see the fine powder of her makeup, the silver of her hair, and the absolute, unadulterated coldness in her blue eyes. She wasn't afraid. She was calculating. She was already looking for the next code to input, the next loophole to exploit. "You think you've caught me," she whispered, her voice so low that Ellen couldn't hear. "But you're a widower with a history of high-stress employment and a child who is currently being treated for a suspicious ingestion. Who do you think the social workers will believe? The woman who has spent 40 years in medical administration, or the man who works with hazardous materials and looks like he hasn't slept in a month?" "That's the beauty of data, Miriam," I said. "It doesn't have a personality. It doesn't care about your reputation. I haven't just mapped your past, I've mapped your current liabilities. You've been using your emeritus access to divert prescriptions. That pharmacy in Westbury, the one with the pharmacist who was your junior clerk 10 years ago, he's already being audited. I didn't have to do much. I just had to point the right people toward the right discrepancies." For the first time, I saw a crack. A small, frantic pulse began to beat in her neck. Her grip on the ceramic plate tightened until her knuckles were white. "What do you want from me?" she asked. The pretense of care was gone. The mom was gone. This was the billing supervisor negotiating a settlement. "Nothing you can give," I replied. "I can make this go away," she said, her voice gaining a frantic edge. "I can tell the family you were mistaken. I can help you with the house. I can ensure the custody evaluators see exactly what I want them to see." "You still think you're in control," I said, tilting my head. "That's your fundamental flaw, Miriam. You believe the system is something you can manipulate forever, but I'm not manipulating the system. I'm simply letting it do what it was designed to do. I'm letting it find the error. And in this equation, you are the error." I turned to Ellen. "Go home, Ellen. If you leave now, and if you provide the statement we discussed in the parking lot, you might stay out of the regulatory fallout. But if you stay here, you're part of the contamination." Ellen didn't hesitate. She grabbed her purse and fled, the front door slamming behind her with a finality that echoed through the house. Miriam watched her sister leave, and for a moment she looked small, not fragile, but diminished, like a predator that had realized the cage was sturdier than it had anticipated. She set the plate down on the counter with a shaking hand. "You're destroying this family," she hissed. "For what? A sense of moral superiority? You're going to be alone, Gavin. No one will come to your holiday dinners. No one will help you when Maya gets sick. I was the bridge. Without me, you're just a man in a quiet house." "I've lived in a quiet house for a long time, Miriam," I said. "And I prefer it to one filled with lies. You weren't a bridge. You were a toll booth. And I'm closing the road." I walked to the front door and held it open. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and coming rain. The street was empty, with the houses across the way glowing with the warm amber light of families who weren't poisoning each other for sport. "Get out," I said. Miriam walked toward me, her head held high, trying to reclaim some shred of her vanishing dignity. As she passed me, she stopped. She didn't look at me, she looked out at the street. "You think this is over," she said. "But I have friends, people who owe me. I have built a life of service that you can't erase with a few emails." "I didn't use emails," I said. "I used the law. Your friends are currently receiving the same audit notices you are. In your world, Miriam, loyalty only lasts as long as the payout. And right now, you're a high-risk investment." She stepped out onto the porch. She turned back to look at me, her face illuminated by the porch light. She looked like a stranger, a woman I had let into my home, a woman I had trusted with my daughter's life, and a woman I now saw with the terrifying clarity of a microscopic slide. "What do you want?" she repeated, her voice thin and reedy. "I want you to realize that you no longer matter," I said. I closed the door. I locked it. I stood in the hallway for a long time, listening to the sound of her footsteps retreating down the driveway. I heard her car start, the engine turning over with a mechanical groan before fading into the distance. I went back into the kitchen. I picked up the lasagna she had brought. It was still warm. I walked it to the trash can and dumped it in, foil and all. I watched the layers of pasta and cheese slide into the waste, a perfect representation of the nourishment she had provided. Then I went to the sink and began to scrub the counter where the sunflower jar had sat. I used industrial-strength cleaner, the kind that breaks down organic compounds on a molecular level. I scrubbed until the granite was cold and gray, until the scent of lavender was replaced by the sharp, clean sting of bleach. My phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from Aris at the lab. The secondary screen is finished. It's exactly what we thought. The concentrations are consistent with long-term, low-dose administration. You were right to pull her out when you did. I looked at the message, then deleted it. I didn't need the validation anymore. I had the map. I had the evidence. And most importantly, I had the silence. I went upstairs to Maya's room. She was home now, sleeping in her own bed, her breathing deep and rhythmic. The lethargy was fading, her color returning to that healthy, vibrant pink that Miriam had tried to dim. I sat in the chair in the corner of her room, the shadows wrapping around me like a protective layer of lead. Miriam realized then that I wasn't reacting emotionally. I wasn't the grieving, broken man she could manage. I was a researcher who had identified a pathogen. She asked me what I wanted, I whispered into the dark. I looked at my daughter, safe and undisturbed by the monsters outside the door. I already have it. The administrative wing of the regional council building was a study in beige and institutional silence. It was a space designed to neutralize conflict through the sheer weight of its banality. I sat in a high-back chair in a conference room that smelled of carpet cleaner and old coffee, waiting for the mediation session to begin. This was the controlled reveal I had meticulously orchestrated. Miriam had arrived with her own legal counsel, a man in a sharp charcoal suit who looked like he specialized in making inconvenient truths disappear into the fine print of settlements. I sat alone. I didn't need a representative because I wasn't there to negotiate. I was there to present a chemical and financial audit. Miriam sat across from me, her posture perfect, her hands folded over a designer handbag. She had regained some of her composure since our confrontation at my house. She looked like a woman ready to receive an apology for a series of unfortunate misunderstandings. Ellen sat 2 seats down from her, looking smaller than ever, her eyes fixed on the speckled pattern of the table. "Mr. Hale," the mediator began, a neutral woman with silver-framed spectacles. "We are here to discuss the concerns raised regarding the care of your daughter and the proposed temporary guardianship transition requested by Mrs. Locke. It is my understanding that you have supplemental documentation to provide." "I do," I said. I opened my briefcase and pulled out a stack of bound reports. I slid one across to the mediator, one to the charcoal suit, and one to Miriam. Before we discuss guardianship, we need to discuss the medical history that has been manufactured over the last 6 months. Miriam didn't open the folder. "Gavin, this is unnecessary. We are all concerned about your mental state. This obsession with data is a clear sign that you are not coping well with our recent loss. No one blames you, but we must prioritize the child." "Let's look at page 4, I said, ignoring her. This is a cross-referenced log of insurance claims from Miriam's former office. It shows a series of overrides performed using a legacy administrative ID that should have been deactivated 3 years ago. These overrides allowed for the dispensing of specific sedative compounds, the same compounds found in the sunflower cookies I submitted for independent analysis. The charcoal suit opened the folder. His expression didn't change, but his pen stopped moving. "The cookies were a delivery system," I continued, my voice steady, devoid of the tremors Miriam expected. "The dosage was calculated to induce lethargy and cognitive fog without triggering an acute respiratory event. It was designed to create the appearance of a neurological decline in my daughter, an illness that would necessitate the very guardianship Mrs. Locke is currently seeking." "This is an outrageous accusation," Miriam said, her voice rising just enough to show she was offended, but not enough to seem panicked. "Those cookies were a family recipe. If there was any contamination, it must have occurred in your home, which is, after all, a warehouse of industrial chemicals." "Look at page 12, I said. "That is a sworn statement from the pharmacist at the Westbury branch. He admits to bypassing the verification protocol because he was instructed to do so by a woman he considered a mentor and a professional superior. He has provided the timestamps of the pickups. They align perfectly with the days Miriam visited my daughter." I looked at Ellen. She was shaking now. Her hands were tucked under the table, but the vibration was visible in her shoulders. "And on page 15, I said, is a corroborating statement regarding the preparation of those items. It describes the intentional addition of a white crystalline powder to the batter. Ellen, would you like to verify the signature on that page?" Miriam turned to her sister, her eyes narrowing into cold, predatory slits. "Ellen, what have you done?" "I couldn't do it, Miriam," Ellen whispered, her voice cracking. "He showed me the numbers. He showed me what would happen if the state got involved. I told you he was too smart. I told you he'd see the pattern. You're a weak, frightened woman, Miriam hissed. She turned back to the mediator, her face a mask of righteous indignation. This is a fabrication. My sister is under extreme duress. Gavin has been harassing her, using his position to intimidate her. I haven't harassed anyone, I said. I've simply provided the authorities with the map. The State Regulatory Board has already begun a formal review of the pediatric billing discrepancies I flagged. They found that the overrides didn't just stop with my daughter. There are 42 other cases over the last decade where high-cost treatments were denied or altered through your ID, Miriam. You weren't just managing our family, you were managing the system for your own benefit. The mediator looked at the charcoal suit. Counselor, I suggest you review the pharmacy affidavits on page 18. They are quite comprehensive. The man in the charcoal suit scanned the pages. He took a long, slow breath and leaned back in his chair. He didn't look at Miriam. He looked at the wall. Mrs. Locke, we need to step outside and discuss the viability of this guardianship petition. I am not going anywhere, Miriam said. She leaned over the table, her face inches from mine. You think you've won? You've just ensured that you have no one. I was the one who kept the family quiet. I was the one who made sure no one questioned your erratic behavior. When I walk out of here, I will make sure everyone knows what you've done to your own kin. No one is going to listen to you, Miriam, I said, because by the time you leave this building, your professional reputation will be non-existent. The board has already issued a freeze on your consultant accounts pending the investigation. Your social standing is tied to your perceived integrity. Without that, you're just a woman who was caught tampering with her granddaughter's health for leverage. The room became very cold. The institutional silence returned, but this time it was heavy with the weight of her collapse. Miriam looked at the mediator, then at her lawyer, then at the sister she had bullied for half a century. She saw the same thing in all of them, the exit. The guardianship petition is withdrawn, the charcoal suit said, his voice flat. My client will be making no further contact with the minor or the father until these administrative matters are resolved. They won't be resolved, I said. They will be documented, permanently. I stood up and closed my briefcase. I felt a strange sense of lightness, as if a physical pressure had been lifted from my chest. I had used her own weapons, bureaucracy, reputation, and the cold logic of the system to erase her influence. I hadn't raised my voice once. I hadn't made a single threat. I had simply applied the correct solvent to the bond she had built around us. As I walked toward the door, Miriam spoke one last time. It wasn't a shout. It was a low, venomous rasp. You're a monster, Gavin. You have no heart. You're just a machine with a paycheck. I stopped at the door and looked back at her. She looked old. For the first time, the silver hair and the fine makeup didn't look like armor. They looked like a costume that no longer fit. I'm a father who can read a lab report, I said. That's all I ever needed to be. I walked out into the bright afternoon sun. The air felt different, cleaner, as if the smog of her presence had finally been scrubbed away. I got into my car and sat there for a moment, watching the entrance of the building. 10 minutes later, I saw them come out. Miriam was walking ahead, her head still high, but her pace was uneven. She looked like a woman trying to walk through a gale. Ellen followed a few paces behind, weeping into a tissue, looking lost. The charcoal suit walked in the opposite direction, already checking his phone, likely looking for a way to distance himself from the wreckage. Miriam stood on the sidewalk, looking around as if she expected a crowd to gather and defend her. But the street was busy with people who didn't know her, who didn't care about her billing codes or her social standing. She was a stranger in a world that no longer owed her anything. I drove away. I didn't head home immediately. I went to the park where Maya was playing under the supervision of the nanny I had hired, a woman with a background in pediatric nursing and a sterling, independent set of references. I watched from a distance as Maya ran across the grass, her movements fluid and energetic. The lethargy was gone. The fog had lifted. She was laughing as she chased a butterfly, her world once again small and safe and filled with the simple, unadulterated joys of a 6-year-old. I knew the fallout wasn't over. There would be more meetings, more questions from the regulatory boards, and a long, quiet process of explaining to the rest of the family why Grandma wouldn't be coming over for Sunday dinner anymore. But the central threat had been neutralized. The map was complete. Miriam had wanted dominance. She had wanted to be the indispensable center of our lives. Instead, I had made her a footnote in a state audit. I had removed her ability to matter. I pulled out my phone and looked at the family group chat. It was blowing up with questions. Miriam, why did you leave the meeting? Ellen, what's going on? Gavin, are you okay? I didn't answer. I didn't need to explain myself to a group of people who had been blinded by her sunflower-painted facade. I simply exited the group. One click, and 30 voices were silenced. I got out of the car and walked toward my daughter. When she saw me, she didn't just wave. She sprinted across the grass and threw her arms around my knees. "Daddy, look how high I jumped." "I saw it, Peanut," I said, lifting her up. She felt light but solid. Real. "I saw everything." She tucked her head into the crook of my neck, and for a moment the world was perfectly still. The system had worked, but only because I had forced it to. I had played her game, and I had ended it on my terms. As we walked back to the car, I felt a vibration in my pocket. A final message from Miriam. I didn't even open it. I simply blocked the number. The peak of the mountain was behind me now. The descent would be quiet, and it would be lonely, but it would be ours. I had one final move to make, the final door to close, and then the silence would be absolute. The Locke family estate was a sprawling colonial house at the end of a cul-de-sac, a monument to the kind of stability Miriam had spent her life curating. It was late, the moon a sliver of bone against the black velvet of the sky. I parked my car at the curb, 2 houses down. I didn't want the glare of headlights to announce my arrival. I wanted the transition to be as seamless and quiet as the chemical reactions I managed in the lab. I walked up the driveway, my footsteps swallowed by the manicured lawn. The house was dark except for a single lamp glowing in the library. That was where she would be. Miriam didn't retreat to bedrooms when she was under siege. She retreated to her archives, to the ledgers and the correspondence that proved she was the architect of her own world. The front door was unlocked. It was a final, arrogant gesture, a belief that her reputation was a more effective barrier than a bolt. I stepped inside, the air smelling of beeswax and old paper. The silence of the house was different from the silence of mine. Mine was the silence of recovery. Hers was the silence of an empty theater after the curtain had been forcibly dropped. I walked toward the library. The door was ajar, a sliver of amber light spilling onto the Persian rug. I pushed it open. Miriam was sitting at her mahogany desk, surrounded by boxes of files. She wasn't crying. She was shredding. The mechanical whir of the machine was the only sound in the room, a rhythmic chewing of the paper trail I had spent weeks mapping. She didn't look up when I entered. She simply fed another handful of documents into the teeth of the machine. "The digital records are already mirrored, Miriam," I said. "Shredding the physical copies is just manual labor. It won't change the audit." She stopped. Her hand hovered over a stack of billing statements. She looked at me, and I saw a version of her that the world had never been allowed to witness. The poise was gone. Her hair was loose, falling in gray wisps around a face that looked like it had been carved from dry, cracked clay. "You've come to gloat," she said. Her voice was a raspy whisper, the chime of her mom persona completely shattered. "You've come to watch the light go out." "I've come to ensure the door is closed," I replied. I walked into the room, standing by the fireplace. The hearth was cold. "I wanted to see if you understood the scale of the collapse." "I understand that you are a small, vengeful man," she spat. She stood up, leaning her weight on the desk. "You think you've stripped me of my life. You think these audits and these statements mean anything to people who have known me for decades. I am Miriam Locke. I have served this community while you were still learning how to use a beaker." "Service is a beautiful mask, isn't it?" I asked. I pulled a small, clear vial from my pocket and set it on the mantel. It was empty, but it represented the end of her influence. "You used your service to buy silence. You used your status to ensure no one looked too closely at the numbers. But the numbers don't have memories, Miriam. They don't care about your garden parties or your church bake sales. They just exist. And they say you've been a thief of health and autonomy for a very long time." "I did what was necessary for the stability of the people around me," she shouted, her voice finally breaking. "I saw families falling apart because they couldn't handle the reality of their situations. I provided a way out. I provided a quiet path. If I managed Maya's transition, it was because you were failing. You were a ghost in that house, and she needed a foundation. You didn't give her a foundation. You gave her a sedative. You tried to manufacture a disability so you could claim the role of the savior. It's the same thing you did with the billing overrides. You created the crisis so you could be the only one with the solution. It's a closed loop of control." I took a step toward the desk. Miriam recoiled, her hip hitting the shredder, which let out a final, fading groan as it finished a page. "The board of directors met an hour ago," I said, my voice dropping to a low, clinical frequency. "They've moved for a full forensic investigation into the last 10 years of your tenure. Every account you touched is being reopened. Every favor you did for your friends in the pharmacy network is being scrutinized under a microscope. By morning, the name Miriam Locke won't be synonymous with service. It will be synonymous with liability." She looked at the phone on her desk. It remained stubbornly silent. The friends who owed her, the network of influence she had spent 40 years building, had already performed their own chemical analysis. They had identified the contamination and were currently busy sanitizing their own lives by cutting her out. "You're going to be a ward of the state's interest, Miriam," I said. "Not as a criminal. I told you I wouldn't give you the drama of a trial, but as a professional pariah. You'll be stripped of your emeritus status. Your pension is being frozen pending the recovery of the diverted funds. Your house is collateral for the legal fees that are about to descend on you." "I'll fight you," she whispered. "I have resources." "No, you don't. I checked your liquidity before I came over. You've spent your life managing other people's money, but you forgot to diversify your own. You're tied to the very institutions that are now purging you. You're the toxin, Miriam, and the system is currently producing antibodies." She sank back into her chair, her eyes fixed on the pile of paper ribbons on the floor. She looked at the desk, at the mahogany, at the symbols of a life she had stolen from the people she claimed to help. It was all vanishing. It was being reduced to a series of administrative errors and regulatory violations. "Why?" she asked. It was the same question she had asked in my kitchen, but now it was stripped of its arrogance. It was the sound of a person realizing they were truly alone. "Why go this far? You could have just told me to stay away. You could have just kept the child." "Because as long as you had a platform, you were a threat," I said. "As long as you had a reputation, you could find a way back in. I didn't want to stop you, Miriam. I wanted to delete you. I wanted to ensure that when Maya grows up and hears your name, it won't be attached to a person, but to a cautionary tale about corporate greed and medical malpractice. You won't be grandma. You'll be a case study." I walked to the door of the library. I stopped and looked back at her. She was reaching for the phone again, her fingers trembling. "Who are you calling, Miriam? Ellen is at a hotel, currently giving a recorded deposition to the board's counsel. Your lawyer has already sent you a disengagement letter because your retainer check was flagged. Your neighbors have seen the auditor's cars." She gripped the receiver, her knuckles white. "Someone will listen. I have done too much for this town for it to end in a library at midnight." "No one is coming," I said. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. They weren't a threat. They were a statement of biological fact. I had removed the nutrients. I had blocked the signals. The organism that was Miriam Locke's social and professional life had no way to sustain itself. She began to dial, her breath coming in quick, shallow hitches. I didn't stay to see who she was trying to reach. It didn't matter. Whether it was a friend, a former colleague, or a sister who no longer answered, the result would be the same. The line would connect to nothing but the sound of her own desperation. I walked out of the house, leaving the front door wide open. Let the night air in, let the dust settle. As I walked down the driveway, I heard a faint, rhythmic sound from inside the house. The shredder had jammed, its motor whining in a high-pitched, useless protest before finally falling silent. I got into my car and started the engine. I didn't look back at the colonial house at the end of the cul-de-sac. I didn't feel a sense of peace, but I felt a profound sense of order. The variables had been balanced. The contamination had been contained. I drove toward the park, toward the small apartment where Maya and I were going to start over. Not as a broken family, but as a unit that had survived a trial of fire and chemistry. The world was quiet now, the streets empty and clean. Miriam reached for the phone one last time, her eyes wide with the realization that the silence was hers to keep. "No one is coming," I whispered to the steering wheel. I turned the corner, the lights of the city flickering in the distance like a new set of data points on a clean screen. The past was a closed file. The future was a blank slide, waiting for the first drop of a new, untainted life.